What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Szamotah, my good friend Danny Abdel-Jabbar, and our frequent guest, Joseph Solis-Mullen. Hey, Joe, how's it going? How are you?
It's going as good as the warmongers who make our foreign policy decisions will allow it to go. That's pretty much where I'm at. I'm in total cynic mode.
Uh-oh.
Okay, so
this is going to be a spicy episode.
First and foremost, guys, sorry for the lack of content over the past 2 weeks. Selfish reasons, I'll be honest. I was in Puerto Rico for my bachelor's party with Danny. That's where we recorded our last episode. So I took time. We took time off to enjoy the beginning of the summer and the last week or the last, I get married in July, the last month or 60-day period of bachelordom. Enough about, my personal trip. Let's talk about the news. That's why you guys are listening. I want to talk about this. To start us off on this show, this New York Times article came out, and you guys have both read it. And the New York Times has been, I think, as good as they are capable of being. Like, they've been pretty factual over the past 2 months or past 100 days since the war in Ukraine started. Obviously, falsifications, they happened through a mission, but overall, the New York Times, I think, is doing a pretty solid job. That was just with their war maps, their day-to-day coverage. Now, they recently just published an article that, to sum it up, it basically says that U.S. intelligence, there's radio silence between the United States and the Ukrainian army. We don't really know what's going on there. There's really not any oversight over the weapons that are going there. We don't really have a good idea of what the casualty figures are in Ukraine. In fact, we actually have a lot more information on Russian casualties, but we don't know the information of how many Ukrainians die. We just know that Zelensky said 100 every single day or so, and 500 wounded. Hear me out right here. My immediate reaction was, this article has to be some type of intelligence operation, because I cannot believe for a second that, or actually I could believe this, just because of what we saw in Afghanistan with the sack of Kabul, and how, our intelligence said that, it was going to be about 3 months until the Afghan army fell, and, the Taliban walk in and it falls in a couple of hours. Now, it's hard for me to believe that there's radio silence between the United States and the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian government, because the U.S. accurately predicted the Russian invasion. And, I'm convinced that, the U.S. is providing most of the intelligence. Actually, they admit that they provide most of the intelligence when it comes to artillery and striking Russian units. So I don't know. What do you guys think of that? Or let me start with Joe, our guest. What do you think?
Well, I think I would agree. Whatever complaints I have with any of the major papers, whether it be the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, you know me. I read all those papers, even though I disagree with much of the commentary that I find in them. I think on a strictly factual basis, I think their coverage of the war, in terms of who's going where, what's going on, has been solid. But I think that about all the papers. I think that about the insane Financial Times. I mean, so on that level, I'm not surprised. Because people want to know about this, and if you're giving crap coverage, it's very easy to pick up another paper. And as you said, a lot of their deceptions have been by omission. For example, by pretending that history started 3 months ago. When, if you even Google the Ukraine-Russia war, everything will tell you it started 8 years ago, right? But they pretend like it started 3 months ago. So on that level, I would say yes, I agree. I would also say that it's odd, because I had actually read a couple of pieces similar to the New York Times piece in other outlets. One of which was the Wall Street Journal, which I read pretty much every day. It's one of the papers I read every day. who had said basically the same thing. And what they were saying was, we don't know where the arms are going, which I know the New York Times says that as well, which that's not surprising, right? I know you wanted to talk about Somalia, and you mentioned Afghanistan. I mean, the playbook is just dump a ton of weapons in there, because who cares? It's a million miles away. Even if it turns into a problem, it's not going to be our problem. And let's be real, there are political pressures, and these have many sources, but you would be risking your political life at this point if you were sitting in Congress and openly defying sending whatever the Ukrainians want. Congress really only ever gets involved in foreign policy when there's basically, an issue they think they can be really, shallow, but, obviously in the right, without asking too many questions. So on the one hand, it's totally realistic to think that they're just dumping weapons in there and have no idea where they're going and are not in contact with the Ukrainian military. You pointed out the fact that they're saying we know more about Russian casualties than Ukrainian casualties and things like that. That could all be true. And in part, the Ukrainian line has been, well, we don't want to give you that information because your intelligence network is just one big leak machine, and it's going to show up in the New York Times tomorrow how it's going, and people are going to realize, oh crap, the war actually isn't going that well. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should start listening to people like Emmanuel Macron, who's getting just crushed this week for saying the only adult things of any Western leader, which is, we seriously need to back this down and look for an off-ramp. And everyone's like, boo, boo, coward. It's like, what do you want to do? And as you pointed out with that article, there's no plan. There's no plan. You read any of the major articles, and they just leave it to your imagination. They make it seem like if this just keeps going, if we just keep dumping arms in there, eventually Putin's going to get ousted, and some Alexei Navalny figure is going to show up, and he's just going to be a handy CIA sock puppet, and isn't that going to be great? And then we'll have China totally encircled. That's how these crazy people think, and they're totally detached from reality, and from the consequences. I mean, the Europeans are bearing the brunt of this. Back in January, you wanted to talk about the economy a little bit. I'll just bring this up now. Back in January, the ECB basically said, we're going to stay soft. We're going to stay accommodative. Our inflation problem is not the same as the United States, which was largely a product of the stimulus and the Federal Reserve's activity, despite what the propaganda machines would have you believe. These are not Putin price spikes. These are the result of our own policies. Europe's inflation is almost entirely carry through from the war. So they are going to they need to stop this. I mean, apart from the refugee crisis and the danger to Europe, they just need to stop it for financial reasons. Do I believe that we're not in contact with the army? No, I don't believe that. I believe the Ukrainians might be being cagey about giving us information, but that would be a wise thing to do from their perspective. And it's not like Washington is beating down the door demanding answers, right? They send whatever the Ukrainians basically want anyway, and make these big public shows of debating, oh, should we send them more weapons or should we not? And what constitutes an offensive weapon? When Putin has been explicit from the beginning, any arms transfers at all are considered belligerent. And that he considers those convoys leaving NATO countries with U.S. troops legitimate targets. So, you said U.S. intelligence, really good, called the invasion. I just want to pitch something to you game theoretically, because from the very beginning, I have said that Washington provoked this on purpose. Because think about it game theoretically, if you think there's a chance Russia's going to invade, and you've got any intelligence that says that, go ahead and use your bullhorn diplomacy, make it public, and put pressure on Putin to actually follow through when you purposely thumb your nose in the face of his, demands, which were like maximalist, outrageous demands. That's your starting position, right? But Joe Biden basically said, forget it. And he left him with the choice of invade Ukraine or back down on a core issue. And so there's a lot of people who have said that, like, basically the U.S. put Putin in a position by saying he was going to invade, that basically he had to invade him. So I think that was a perfectly reasonable strategy for our deep state planners to have. Whatever the morality of it is, that's not a concern for them. We starved 500,000 Iraqi children to death in the 1990s to teach Saddam Hussein a lesson. So I don't ever think morality comes into play in these arguments, and I think most of what we get is manipulation. And the New York Times is definitely included. I mean, they are a mouthpiece of the government. you're never going to see them reporting something against
Hey Danny, can you put yourself on mute when that motorcycle comes by?
It's already gone. I did.
Okay.
I was just gonna say maybe we can take a look at what the reasons why this New York Times article states that we don't know anything about what's going on that side, and to kind of sum it up a little bit, the article is basically saying that we've been targeting Russia with our American spy agencies for the last 75 years. So we've got, the types of systems and workflows to be able to, go after information from Russia. So obviously we're going to have a head start in that respect. And on the other hand, until somewhat recently when Ukraine became its own thing, and even more recently when we started aligning ourselves more closely with Ukraine about 8 years ago, and even more recently, if you want to bring it to the beginning of this war, our MO, our modus operandi here was not to spy on Ukraine, but rather to help them build up their own intelligence agencies. Now, obviously, that comes with its own channels of information, like we should be knowing things by virtue of helping them set up their own. But I guess the argument that this article is trying to point out is that because they're not adversarial to us, we don't have the same capabilities set up because we don't expect to need any information against them. I imagine similar things might be true of other friendly nations that don't necessarily communicate with us, regularly. That's a possibility, right? So again, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, just throwing out the arguments, And another reason I think that they're trying to encapsulate here is that Zelensky, to your point, Joe, he's kind of holding his cards close to the chest. Apparently, we know what their strategic goals are, but just not the steps that they're taking to get to those goals. And one of the interesting points that they pointed out was that one of the reasons why they might not be telling us the exact nitty gritty, the day to day, even just down to the counts of how many people died, was because it could have an impact on, the U.S. and or Western coalitions opinions on how to support Ukraine, right? So if they were telling you, oh, well, today we lost 5,000 people, right? We might think twice about whether or not they'd have the capabilities to win this war or at least achieve their strategic goals. So by keeping it at the high level strategic goal and not reporting back on the leading indicators of success for those goals, they're able to keep the interests aligned and high, and it's almost like checking the stock market. When I'm not a big stock person, I have some investments. When I would check them every day, I'd freak out, right? And I'd be like, oh God, I'm down 5% today. Should I sell? This is going to go bad. But realistically, I think if you don't check it every day and you check it maybe once a week or once a month or something like that, you start to flatten out those ups and downs. And I think that's the play that this article in particular is trying to paint for the Ukrainian side, for Zelensky specifically. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think I had already kind of touched on that in my lengthy discourse on my dislike of the New York Times generally, because they've been so wrong on so many things, and they're only a paper of record in the sense that retrospectively they run very tiny corrections about how wrong they were. Everything from Hunter Biden's laptop to WMDs in Iraq, and we can go all the way back further than that. As far as U.S. intelligence capabilities, I would not give them that much credit. They were totally shocked by the Soviet collapse. They were totally caught up for all the billions of dollars we dumped into spying on them. We were completely shocked by the one thing that you would think they would have some insights on. I think it's perfectly reasonable for Zelensky to play this thing close to the chest because Washington, even though he's their guy. I mean, well, I shouldn't even say that. He got elected on a peace platform. He ran on implementing the Minsk II Accords, and he got into office and found that the ultranationalists who were being backed by the United States basically laughed him off. and said, we're not doing any such thing. And so that basically put him in a position.
There's video footage of that, by the way. Sorry to interrupt,
exactly.
but there's video footage of him going to confront some of these Azov guys, and they basically just laugh at him.
Yeah, because they had Washington's support, right? They were Washington's guys. They're our kind of people. They're moderate rebels. Okay, we like moderate rebels. So, I think it's very smart of Zelensky to play it close to the chest, because the war is not going particularly well for them. And without tons of Western arms, this thing would have been over already. So I don't think there's really any controversy about that position. We're literally paying to keep their government afloat. I mean, their government is a wreck. They've got no money coming in. They can't get their foodstuffs out. But from Washington's perspective, in terms of geostrategy, things are going great. From their perspective, they're a little annoyed that, now the election's coming up and, they're trying to blame inflation on Putin. So maybe that'll work for the midterms, but I don't know. There was a lot of talk about you have to be tough on Russia because you looked so weak leaving Afghanistan. So again, domestic political considerations, like you left Afghanistan in the fall and it looked so cowardly and weak and pathetic. Even though it was totally the right decision to get out of there, although we'll never actually leave the Middle East, because the Middle East is important to China, and their goal is to mess with China ultimately.
Right.
So I know that among Democrats, Putin has become this, like, it is the thing that explains all bad things. Putin did it. But on a more general level, I think from like the deep state's perspective, our actual security planners, the people who actually make the policies, I think they were looking at China this whole time, because the similarities between this and the Taiwan conflict are just too obvious. And Taiwan is far more strategically important than Ukraine, period. Full stop. It's not even close. And this was a nice testing case for them to see how well their sanctions worked and to experiment, and they'll fine tune them, and that's just another day in the Beltway, I guess. That's how it goes. All the people dying aren't Americans, so we know that the American public is not averse to casualties and killing tons of people. They're averse to American casualties. They're allergic to those, but they don't care how many Yemenis or Iraqis or Afghanis or Ukrainians, anybody dies. I always like to tell people I talk to from like Australia, Indonesia, Philippines, like, our government would sacrifice millions of you in a proxy conflict with China. So don't mistake it. And most of them know. Most of them are pretty overt about it. I find that there's actually a lot of the elites in all countries are very small, and they tend to know each other a lot. And so when you bring on so-and-so from the Philippines, like, who's spouting an American line, like, of course, they've had a lot of contacts with high-level Americans. They might have done university study in the United States. They might have held a think tank fellowship for a while. So there's a lot of that going on. There's also foreign governments literally funding think tanks, funding universities. Like, the Qataris donate almost $1 billion to U.S. universities. $1 billion.
That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money. We look at someone like the NRA and it's like, wow, they're really spending a lot of money. They're not spending anything compared to what the Saudis or another foreign government can and do spend to influence our policies. And that's probably why they're such a disaster and not in our interests at all, like the war in Ukraine and like the eventual conflict over Taiwan.
Maybe we can talk about the eventual conflict in Taiwan. I don't think we've talked about this specifically, but not too long ago, Biden made a little bit of a gaffe saying that we would go ahead and back Taiwan.
It's the fourth time he did that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a gaffe anymore. That's policy. That's what the military planners and the deep state. That's what the policy is. Because
is he saying the quiet thing out loud?
The policy only ever changed because China was useful in balancing against the Soviet Union. But as soon as that threat went away, all of a sudden they looked at the deal they cut with Beijing in the 90s and were like, well, that kind of seems like a handcuff on our freedom of movement. Aren't we in charge now? Can't we start tweaking this policy? And that's exactly what's happened. If you look at what was agreed to, we were not to have a diplomatic presence. We got a huge multi-billion-dollar complex flying an American flag with U.S. troops there. We got U.S. military trainers there. We weren't supposed to have those either. I mean, we weren't supposed to have any defense commitment to Taiwan. The Taiwan Relations Act specifically precludes that, saying only the supply of defensive weapons. So, I mean, the policy has been slowly eroded for decades. There was a really great piece by the guy who actually was Nixon's translator on the Beijing trip, talking about the slow erosion of the U.S. policy toward Taiwan, to the point where now, I mean, it does not matter. That's why I tell people, it doesn't matter what Jake Sullivan or Antony Blinken or anyone comes out and says after, like, well, he didn't mean the thing he obviously just said again. Come on, guys.
Yeah.
What do you take that for? Policy? Come on. And people talk about Donald Trump being a loose cannon. My God. I mean, it's really incredible. And you know, we talk about like the op-ed page. Yes, every once in a while, the op-ed pages, even foreign affairs, will occasionally give someone space, like Dr. John Mearsheimer or Stephen Walt, space to say something against message. But you know what happens next? The very next issue is a bunch of pieces criticizing that piece. Like, it basically serves as a way to like introduce a contrary opinion and then just crap all over it for days afterwards, or issues afterwards. Like, I literally watch it happen. Like, I read way too much news, way too much. I actually have noticed since the Ukraine war really picked up steam here when Russia invaded, which that will turn up the volume, there has been a slow shift in like coverage on China. Whereas before it was always, China is so freaking dangerous and scary, and oh my God, shouldn't we be scared of them? Over the last few months, you've started to see more and more articles about, well, actually, China is kind of weak compared to us. And like their economy, that's kind of struggling. And like militarily, we're probably much stronger than them, you know. And Taiwan's an island. So like, you know, that's way easier to intervene, you know, ignoring the fact that the Chinese have missile batteries everywhere that could blow up an aircraft carrier from 2,500 miles away, more sea mines than any other country on Earth, and even more submarines than us. So when we had talked about the area denial, you know, strategy, and we had talked about like their lack of ships, lack of surface vessels, like that is totally reasonable to say that like China's surface vessel fleet is a total joke at this point. Although that didn't stop the Wall Street Journal from running a series of alarmist pieces about the Chinese floating an aircraft carrier, which whoop-de-doo, it's a piece of crap compared to our own, and it's one aircraft carrier. But we're supposed to feel super duper alarmed about this.
Right.
Very unsafe. I mean, I just don't know. The Solomon Islands basing agreement. I don't know if you guys saw that in the news, but that was regular fodder for weeks after that. And it's just outrageous to act like, I don't know if you guys know the backstory there at all, but basically there had been a bunch of anti-Chinese riots and some Chinese had been killed and their businesses got burned down. And, you know, they basically took a couple of years, negotiated an agreement where they could bring their ships around occasionally, check on things. And the Hawks in Washington are just beside themselves. This is just outrageous, and we're so unsafe now. And
Australia got really up in arms about that.
How would we react if another country treated us that way and just acted totally belligerent towards us all the time? And it's not, and it's literally, it goes from blocking adoptions of kids, canceling university transfers, doing these like bizarre spy hunts for people within academia with any ties to China. Recently, there was a small semiconductor plant in Britain that was bought by a Chinese Dutch affiliated firm. The Biden administration behind the scenes let it be known to the Johnson government that it'd be better if that deal got reversed. And now that deal is under review. Even though the Wall Street Journal itself, you know, in a throwaway sentence admits that, like, actually, these are pretty low-tech chips that mostly go in like hair dryers and ovens. But it is super dangerous, and we need to because the pretext was national security.
Right. National
security. I mean, it's on every level, you know, and even libertarians are bad on this issue sometimes. I know that there's a serious split within the Libertarian Party. But like, I just picked up a copy of Reason the other day, which is like the flagship libertarian publication, and they had this whole spread about Ukraine and China and stuff that was just so wrong, like just ridiculous in how wrong it was. So, I mean, the Hawks are in the ascendancy, and I don't see our policies getting much better from here. Taiwan is a definite flashpoint. I think Henry Kissinger, who I don't like Henry Kissinger, but
I was surprised to read that he's still alive, to be honest.
And giving more lucid commentary than Joe Biden could have at 25 when he was plagiarizing papers in college. I mean, his speech was a good one. I mean, at Davos, if you take a look at it, and he was very explicit. Like the relationship, he said a lot of things, but the relationship between China and the United States should not become about Taiwan, but it's increasingly becoming about Taiwan, and that was a deliberate choice. You know, people like to criticize you for saying, well, you know, countries have core interests and we should tiptoe around those and not do provocative things like orchestrate a coup in Ukraine and put our own proconsular government in there and then send the CIA in to start, you know, training neo-Nazis and, you know, just acting like it was all Russia's fault to begin with. Like, saying something like that is totally out of line. You know, just like it's out of line to say something like Taiwan is not a country, even though it's not, and the UN says so, and the U.S. government line says so.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, the truth is not what politics is about. So.
Well, Joe, let me ask you this. So Russia it's one thing to have a hostile policy towards Russia. You know, they're relatively poor for their population size. I think like 140 million people there. Now, isn't there enough like big business pressure in the United States that wants access to Chinese markets? Like, isn't there enough business pressure to kind of trying to force the government
steer
not to be to steer policy towards something that is not like, you know, something that
super hostile
potentially hostile.
Well, a lot of times corporate interests are important, but again, I would point out that the money corporate lobbyists spend is often dwarfed by the money foreign governments spend. The Taiwanese lobby us hard. The Ukrainians lobby us harder than anyone, or have over the last year. There was a great piece by Ben Freeman about that, showing that for the money, there's no lobby more active in Washington than Ukraine over the last couple of years. I would say this. Yes, on one level, but on another level,
2017 will be the year of offense. I'm sorry.
Well, the thing is,
we will make the case in Washington for Ukraine.
They do.
I'm sorry, I had
Yeah.
I had to interrupt. Did you hear that?
Not.
Did you hear that speech from Lindsey Graham?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
2017 will be the year of offense.
At least
Tom
Cotton was willing to die for U.S. belligerence. Lindsey Graham's a total chicken hawk, right? Like whatever you think about Tom Cotton, he was willing to die. So even though he has crazy ideas, I can't really, you know, fault him for that. Same with Pete Meyer, my own rep. Like he was willing to die for U.S. imperialism. So like, all right, I guess
you gotta
Dan
respect that
Crenshaw
anyway,
is another one.
It's better than Cheney, you know, or someone like that. No, with regard to business interests in China, yes, those were very important. But the Communist Party, especially Xi Jinping, orchestrated a silly crackdown and really freaked out a lot of investors. And there were a lot of problems in the Chinese economy already. And I'd written about those, but then the CCP's actions really freaked out investors, and now there's a fear of sanctions because what if the company you invest in gets caught doing business with Russia? And you know, you can read it in basically every major paper, pieces about how dangerous to be doing business in China, and even papers like the American Conservative or the National Review have devoted whole cover stories to basically demonizing investment in China. Like basically ran a whole cover story back in November about the Bush family has been investing in China for decades. And it's like, is that bad? Didn't they help raise like 1 billion people out of poverty or something? We all brag about, over the last 4 years, we've cut global poverty in half. It's like most of that was China raising its 1 billion people out of poverty. So no,
that was the best thing that ever happened in world history.
But what'd you say?
That's like in the 1980s when you know, Milton Friedman goes over to China and says, "Hey guys, you need prices. Like this isn't working out," and they you know, become capitalist, and you know, the standard of living goes from, you know, cannibal raids to you know, constructing these major cities. That's the biggest increase,
huge turnaround
in standard of living I can think of in world history. Like hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty And
And now that they're rich,
actually,
all they're asking for all the scaremongering in books like the 100-Year Marathon and the China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order, and all these garbage books that people get paid to write that are just totally devoid of any kind of, perspective at all, except China is super dangerous and here's why. Totally neglecting the fact that it was the U.S. that militarized the relationship. And I'll take you back to the point when, because actually the CCP's own internal documents that, over the years, they release them, they release English translations. They talk about the Congress's reaction, the U.S. Congress's reaction to the Tiananmen Square crackdown, which was a massacre, right? Like they shot a bunch of people.
Yep.
No different than our guys shooting a bunch of people in some crowd control exercises, but because it's China and Congress saw an easy issue, they started slapping sanctions on China. And the Chinese regime would not believe George H.W. Bush, who was trying to tell them like, yeah, we don't want to do this. We know we're trying to keep good relations, but we can't really control what Congress does. The Chinese did not believe them. Then the Gulf War came along, and they had expected the U.S. to get bogged down like a Vietnam-style quagmire. And instead, what happened was the U.S. bombed the living crap out of Saddam's army and drove them off in like a week. That seriously freaked them out too, and it freaked out the Russians as well. And then the Taiwan Straits crisis. Literally another one. Like the Taiwanese being totally belligerent, and the U.S. just comes in with the muscle, right? Sails the aircraft carriers right through from Eisenhower onward. That was the policy. And China came to realize, because the Chinese study what Americans write and talk about, and all the talk was about liberal capitalist democracy, the end of history. All regimes will be like this, and America will make it that way. Well, if you're not a liberal capitalist democracy, how do you think that bodes for you? Not well.
Not very well.
Right? Especially when you consider the actions of the U.S. Congress and then the actions of the Bill Clinton administration, which, say whatever you want about George H.W. Bush. I've written plenty of critical stuff about it, but I always try and include something nice because I really think he was the last competent leader we had on foreign policy in the White House, because he tried to manage the breakup of the Soviet Union well. He had lots of intelligent things to say about Ukraine and the potential dangers there. He also knew the dangers of provoking China and ruining the relationship that had been cultivated there. But that just all got thrown out the window.
He also stood up to the Israel lobby sometimes.
Right. And so, it's tough, because today I think we can all be realistic. U.S. politics is driven by pandering to whatever they think the public will latch onto. It is not about making unpopular decisions that are in the national interest. It is about making the decision that is going to get you reelected and then just kick the can down the road. How are we $30 trillion in debt when it's a simple matter of making some budgetary cuts and raising some taxes? It's really that simple, but nobody does it. They all criticize each other, and then they run huge deficits, which it's interesting. Our annual deficit, it's interesting, is basically what we spend on our military, which is like $1 trillion once everything's said and done. So like we're playing
Sounds
empire.
Like we got a solution.
We're playing empire on the credit card. That's the reason I have become totally committed to defaulting on the U.S. debt. I wasn't for years, and I've become convinced that it's the only way we're going to shut off imperial mode, is if we destroy the ability for them to execute the military Keynesianism that they've become so comfortable doing. So we could try and force that would force the Fed to try and take it all onto its own balance sheet, and it could theoretically do that, but monetizing the debt in that way is not good, and we have a lot of inflation right now, which shouldn't surprise anyone.
Well, what would be the consequences of defaulting? Like, what would happen to the average American?
For the average American? Well, it's hard to say. I mean, it would in large part depend on the reactions of the international community, because there are a lot of foreign debt holders. This would not be the first time we've defaulted on a debt. We have forced investors to take haircuts multiple times, almost from the inception. Alexander Hamilton forced investors to take a steep haircut on the debt, and so did Nixon when he went off gold unilaterally. That amounted to a huge haircut for everyone holding U.S. debt. And the U.S. basically said, what are you going to do about it? Well, at the time, 1971, 72, no one could really do anything, right? There was no alternative. Today, it's easier to imagine an alternative, where all of a sudden countries, and there's been talk about this because of the weaponization of the financial international financial system by the United States over this war, over whether or not it's smart for a country like Saudi Arabia or China to be buying so much U.S. debt, which, frankly, is probably not a good idea at this point, and they should probably stop doing it. If I were one of their strategists, that's probably what I would recommend. It's tough to find alternatives, but again, if they were concerned about the political ramifications, the Fed could short-term take everything onto its own balance sheet. I don't know how it would go long-term, but I know hundreds of millions and, hundreds of thousands and millions of people wouldn't get bombed to death in my name and on my dollar in the name of keeping me supposedly safe when there's no evidence that it does that at all. So
what does it mean to take it on, the Fed could take it on their own balance sheet? What does that mean?
The Fed could just buy it all itself. When the Fed does an open market transaction, all that means is the treasuries that are issued by the Treasury, the Fed just digitally prints some money and buys those treasuries. That's all that.
Would that create like inflation because they'd have to whip up money out of nowhere?
Yeah.
So then defaulting on those.
It would create inflation, and that's part of why we have inflation now, because there was a lot of debt monetization going on apart from the interest rate policies and all the other things that were going on, the QE. And so, yeah, I mean, the Fed could theoretically take the entire economy onto its balance sheet. Like, that would be disastrous, but hardly more disastrous than the last 30 years of U.S. policy, which have made us poor, unsafe, and honestly, at home, it's definitely caused a lot of problems. I mean, it resulted in the birth of the national security state and apparatus that spy on us continually and spy on foreign leaders. I remember you said something about we don't keep close tabs on our allies. I can still remember the day I woke up to Angela Merkel blowing up Obama's phone because she found out that the CIA had bugged her phone.
Yeah.
And she called Obama demanding to know if it was true. And I really wish I could have seen Obama handle that phone call because he was such a non-confrontational guy. Like,
Angela, calm down. Calm down, Angela.
You know where
calm down.
Yeah.
I don't know what those folks do over the CIA. They told me
get
that.
Your schnitzels in a twist.
But no, I mean, I obviously don't want any wars. And look, it's not like Ukraine, is going to be some wealthy, prosperous country after this. They weren't before. They won't be after. Who is this for? The EU agreement that sparked the so-called Revolution of Dignity in 2014, but which was a blatant U.S.-backed coup. I mean, they paint that EU association agreement as a choice between freedom and prosperity and democracy and evil old Putin. And it was Putin who torpedoed it by bullying and bribing the malleable, weak Yanukovych. Wrong. Not what happened at all. Right? I mean, basically, Yanukovych showed up to sign the quote-unquote association agreement and found an agreement that no other country had ever been asked to sign, which said you will, A, be joining the EU, you will not do any business with Russia, and you will adhere to joint European security policies. Huh. What's that mean? Oh, NATO. That's right. It's NATO without saying NATO. These were stupid, provocative moves. And Brussels and Washington, they had to have known what was going on. And after things went bad and the French and the Germans negotiated the Minsk Accords, basically Angela Merkel gave Obama a courtesy call, like, hey, I'm going to do this. And Obama was like, yeah, whatever. Because he had no intention of ever following through on it. Basically, the forces who were, armed and didn't want to quit the fight against Russia basically just turned to Washington and said, we have to stop. And Washington was like, no, actually, we'll train you guys. And, maybe eventually we'll get a president to send you some real hardware, which eventually they bullied and battered Trump into doing. So
anecdotally, I think public opinion is changing. I know there's polling data that suggests that less and less Americans are supporting the war in Ukraine or supporting further escalations. And I guess what the realist school is suggesting, or the realist on like John Mearsheimer, for example, his big thing is that the United States made a big mistake in actually, fostering the economic development of China in the 1980s. Like, that was a mistake, and the U.S. is going to be paying for it. And, China is going to be a real enemy in the theme of like great power politics, they're going to be the real enemy. So Russia and China is going to be this dangerous enemy that the United States is going to have to contend with. And I don't know, I think there actually is some truth to that. That is actually a dangerous enemy. What do you think? I know I just ranted on, so I don't know if you want to take any of my points.
We made them dangerous. Yeah. Policies made them insanely dangerous. But what does that mean? We should escalate. We should push all in. We made tons of mistakes, and now we should just fight them now that they're strong. I mean, it was look. If you're interested in the moral argument, it is more moral to have let them abuse their trading privileges. Everything from favored nation status to WTO membership, even though they never followed the rules ever. If they'd occasionally get their hands slapped real hard eventually and like say something or make a minor tweak, but they were always flouting the rules, and their labor standards were a joke. I mean, it was basically slave labor in a lot of cases in these special economic zones set up in part with Xi Jinping was one of them. He actually was the one who fostered oh gosh, why am I blanking on his name now? Jack Ma, Alibaba. I think that's why he came down so hard on him. He was like, I made you. How dare you speak out of line against me? So, but anyway, it really was. I couldn't even believe it when Jack Ma criticized their policies publicly and then promptly vanished for 3 months, and his company's IPO was destroyed. But which again freaked out Western investors, freaked out Western capitalists. So, but no, I think if you want to make a strictly moral argument, it was more important to think about how many children did not die of malnutrition during that time. Yes, now China is in a state where it can defend its interests. Let's be clear what we know its interests are for all the scaremongering about invading every country in the region and landing on our west coast, which people like Tom Cotton actually seriously believe, or want you to seriously believe that they seriously believe is the logical end game for China, even though that's never what they've said. And there's no real precedent. I mean, yes, at various stages over their 2,000-year histories, yes, China has fought wars with, modern day Vietnam, the kingdoms there, the Koreas, sure. But in terms of actual policy, they've said they want the United States to stop meddling in its internal affairs, which we have been doing since the 1850s. That's not a mistake on my part saying 1850s. Franklin Delanor's grandfather was one of the old China hands who helped keep the quote unquote open door. This was basically when all the strong imperial powers were feasting on a weak China, and the U.S. basically, their argument was, well, we would prefer people not take advantage of China, but if they are, everyone should have an equal shot at it. And we continually intervened in Chinese politics for years after that, and actually deployed troops. I actually got into an argument with some person on the foreign affairs thread who eventually had to give up when, a simple Google search revealed that, wow, obviously we have. It's not a secret. That's the thing about our government's actions. Most of it is public information. People act like you're some kind of conspiratorial nut job. The government literally publishes most of the stuff. We have a very free society in terms of our access to information. There's just so much of it, and people are so uninterested, and this stuff matters so little to their lives. But social media gives them the ability to have an opinion about everything, which is terrible. And so, of course, the Ukraine war starts. It's a pretty clear case of one country invading another, which is bad. So we're all opposed to that. But they don't know anything about it. So they just gung-ho, we support Ukraine. And so the Congress people check their Twitter and they're like, well, I better support Ukraine. What's the establishment? What's the foreign policy establishment in Pentagon telling me we should do? The Pentagon has tons of plans. That's all they do is plan. Their whole job is planning. So of course they have ideas and they embrace them and things escalate because of course it's the military. We have such militarized diplomacy. It's nuts. I mean, we reach for the stick or threaten it regularly. Our hard power, our use of economic sanctions. Those were considered a form of warfare. Right up until the U.S. basically said, okay, guys, this is no longer considered an act of war, but we are going to try and kill large numbers of your people. So, and make you poorer for disagreeing with us, basically. Even though they don't work, if they worked, Cuba would not still be Cuba, but it is. And sanctions couldn't even break Cuba, but it's going to break Iran and North Korea and Russia, and it'll break China too. So they better watch it.
Well,
I
does that mean our
believe this.
sorry? Does that mean our like? Would you argue that our soft power sucks, or just that we're not?
Our soft power was
willing to
destroyed
use
by our overwhelming use of hard power. Economic power is not soft power. Soft power is things like cultural influences, commercial influences, people wanting to emulate your kind of political system. Economic power is fundamentally an aspect of hard power. Military power is the most hard edge of hard power. But if you look in the actual literature, the economic actions are considered an aspect of hard power. So like Joseph Nye, who was in the Clinton administration, he's a really great political scientist. I disagree with him about a lot of things, but I think he's a very smart guy. He's written a lot about American soft power. And in the 1990s, he wrote a whole string of really great books about him that I highly recommend. Anybody who's interested want to read. They're great. But no, I mean, you can basically chart, opinions about public opinion. Which is hard to know, hard to trust polls, but like certainly in official communiques, fear and discomfort with the United States and our government peaked during times when we were being very belligerent, which shouldn't really be surprising. I mean, it's hard to tell people you're a peace-loving, prosperous republic when, all you do is go around blowing people up, and just writing about it in these really, I was just reading a book by, who was it? It was some ex-CIA guy writing about our first intervention in Beirut, 1958. And there was a passage where he talked about suppressing dissent. And it was just a one-line throwaway where he said, after heavy fire, troops were able to regain control of the streets. Now, that is political speak for U.S.-backed soldiers shot a whole bunch of unarmed civilians and cleared the streets, except for the corpses. When we say that there were, collateral damage, they don't even use that word anymore because everybody knows what it means, and they always try and put distance between themselves and what's going on using proxies. The war in Yemen, I mean, that's a perfect example. Even in Ukraine, where our guys were doing most of the killing. The UN says 14,000 people were killed between the coup in 2014 and the outbreak of renewed, real hostilities when Russia invaded Ukraine. The overwhelming number of them were Ukrainians killed by the Ukrainian government. I mean, 10,000 people got killed. Over what? They didn't want to support a government that had been put in place by a foreign power and that was trying to make the Russian language illegal and all sorts of other kinds of stuff that was obviously provocative. I don't understand why any of this is at all controversial. Actually, I do. It's because most people are grossly uninformed about these issues and they are lied to constantly. And when I say lied to, like Henry said, it's lies of omission. You got to stay on message. And the only mistake that Biden and company made was trying to pin all the economic problems we're having right now on Putin. Because in truth, it's not really Putin's fault. We're not getting hit terribly. There are a lot of countries that are going to be horribly, horribly devastated and are being horribly devastated right now. And I actually want to talk about that because it's something that really is just awful. Let's go into it. Okay. So for example,
let me interrupt you real quick. Joe, let me interrupt you real quick. Did you see hear Putin's speech from a couple of days ago about the U.S. inflation, about being blamed for all the economic problems in the United States?
A couple days ago? Because I read something from him last week.
It might have been a week ago.
Did he say something?
It was recently. It was recently. He had a full speech. That it was like a 20-minute speech on U.S. monetary policy, and I had never you would never ever hear a U.S. politician go as in depth. And basically, and I'm just like listening to it. Like I've never heard like a U.S. politician explain U.S. monetary policy better than Vladimir Putin did just now. And basically, he goes on and he just talks about how the reason for the inflation in the United States is because of their spending during COVID-19. We had the same policy. And then he says in this, he's like, we actually had the same policy, but we were more effective in like our money printing during the lockdowns. But, he goes on for 20 minutes using like statistics. And I'm like, I've never heard a Western leader go so in depth in monetary policy.
Yeah, I mean,
he's provocative and
yeah,
he's provocative in some things, and some things are probably he's kind of using skewed figures, but like just the spirit of the debate or the argument was there, and I was like, wow, this is pretty crazy. And then he goes on to talk about the solutions for the food crisis, and he starts blaming Ukraine for how there's the mines around Odessa, but
from a technocratic standpoint, Putin and Xi are both far more versed and sound far more competent than any of our own leaders, but our leaders aren't really the ones making the policies anyway. So I guess, from a public perception, it does look bad. But I mean, having read years and years of Putin's speeches, I mean, yes, he is, like most politicians, an inveterate liar. Who likes to use statistics for their own means. But like, yes, it was essentially correct in saying that the U.S. inflation has very little to do with the war in Ukraine. It has a lot to do with China's lockdowns, which, again, have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. It has to do with our monetary and fiscal policy, well, let me just say this about the food. So the Russians are stealing Ukrainian grain and trying to sell it abroad. Obvious thing to do. The Biden administration has let a bunch of these really poor countries who are desperate for this food, let them know, don't take that food. That's stolen Ukrainian grain. And it's like, are you kidding me? You got countries where people where literally they're talking about 1 million people starving to death. Like, don't you dare take that food. Don't you do it. Like,
we're going to sanction you if you take that food.
From a global public relations perspective, knowing just how much resistance there is in the developing world to so many of these policies, like, this wasn't even something that needed to be in the media. Like, it could have just been a quiet, like, go ahead, go ahead. It never needed to be a story. And instead they made it a story and just made it the grossest, most immoral story ever. That in order to help shore up our war effort, your people need to starve to death. All right. Start taking this more seriously now. It's just shocking.
This is going beyond just fighting to the last Ukrainian. This is now fighting till the last starving Yemeni as well.
I have this funny image of some U.S. official saying, take it out of your mouth, out of your mouth now. That's Ukrainian grain. Take that out of your mouth right now. That's Ukrainian grain.
And this stuff sounds terrible because it's defending Putin. It's not defending Putin. It's making general observations about things. Like, I don't have a position other than that countries shouldn't invade each other and that it's wrong to invade other countries. That being said, there's a reason the invasion happened. It seems pretty clear to me why it happened. States are not moral or immoral actors. Like, states have logics. They have interests. They don't even have permanent friends. They have interests. And if you get in the way of a core interest, history shows and logic dictates that the stick comes out. And so people criticize me for saying things like what I say and write publicly all the time. And for me, it's just like, do you want to have more of these conflicts in the future or not? Because to me, we want to reduce human suffering, raise human betterment. Just take a look around the world. Is it better or worse from the Ukraine war? Okay, what caused the Ukraine war? Well, Putin invaded. Well, of course fucking Putin invaded. And here's another thing. I've stopped introducing all of my articles and talks on this, but with I unambiguously, criticize Putin, it's his war, because it occurred to me, no other conflict has that ever been a requirement. I've gone back and reviewed countless articles and interviews about our totally illegal invasions of Iraq and of Serbia. And no commentator ever started their interview by saying, I unequivocally disavow this illegal invasion of Iraq, except for George W. Bush, who went ahead and said it the other day in a typical. Did you guys catch that? Please tell me you saw that.
The Frody.
In one of George W. Bush's first public speaking events ever, they gave him a microphone, and he goes ahead and makes a classic George W. Bush flub, which was really probably just a Freudian slip, really.
No dictator for 20 years should be able to invade another country, like Iraq. I mean Ukraine.
If anyone's unfamiliar with what happened, George W. Bush was basically in the middle of this long, extended discourse about how bad Putin was and how bad it was to invade other countries. But then when it got time to say Ukraine, he accidentally said Iraq. Whoops. Yeah. And then he just and then he literally was just kind of like, whatever. Yeah, whatever.
That's me.
Whatever.
And then everybody laughed about it because everybody knew.
That's
me.
U.S. soldiers have all sorts of health issues from those stupid burn pits. All sorts of psychological issues. Like, I have friends who killed themselves who were over there. Like, fuck you. And his whole stupid fucking audience that laughed. And we're just giving him a chuckle and like, he's an old guy.
That's our George.
It's our George. Yeah, it's like I tell people, you want to go by body count, the U.S. presidents, just since if you go Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, we have killed, directly or indirectly, way more people than China or Russia or North Korea or any country you want to pick. But if you aren't willing to say that we are that white city on a hill and everything we do is great, and if there are any mistakes, well, they were just with the best of intentions. I mean, I have many bridges to sell in Brooklyn if people really believe this. I mean, you have to willingly not look. You have to purposely not look at the facts. And refusing to parrot the government's line is somehow unpatriotic. Our government is not the country. Republicans and Democrats are not the country. Their policies suck. They've made us unsafe. They spy on us all the time. They've gotten us $30 trillion in debt. And disagreeing with their lines is somehow unpatriotic. For me, I mean, that's just outrageous. So if anyone is listening to this and is like, read Noam Chomsky's The Responsibility of Intellectuals. Because if the Ukraine war is just too sensitive to you, maybe wind it back and read about Vietnam and option to that war.
Mm-hmm.
Because you'll find that, oh, wow, a lot of the same stuff was going on there. Actually, the same stuff. And it was only people who, like me, are just secure and in a position where I can just say whatever I want and no one can touch me. Like, there's nothing anyone can hold over my head. No job, no money, no nothing. Actually, it was very telling. Both Stephen Walt and Stephen Cohen had said that they had been approached by former students who said they felt very strongly against U.S. foreign policy and they wanted to speak out about it. And they were counseled by these two very not, realist, not pro all this stuff we've been doing, counseled them to just keep their head down and just do the work because they were going to destroy their careers. You look at these kids who are in college, they get themselves $100,000, $200,000 in debt, and you get offered a job. And all you have to do is say stuff that passes for common sense anyway, and no one's going to call you out on it. And if you do say it, you'll get a promotion and more money. So it's not complicated why this stuff happened. Just like I always tell people, read Lockheed Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, which explains to you how Bruce Jackson in the lobby to expand NATO, basically, that's why it happened. It was to sell jets and stuff. Like, I mean, it's very bad. And you look at a situation now and, well, if you back out now, Putin is just going to be encouraged to go invade other places. Well, that rests on the assumption that the reason he invaded Ukraine was because the U.S. looked weak. Is that why he invaded Ukraine? That's a pretty revisionist history as far as I'm concerned. I don't know what you guys' take on that is, but I don't know if you've been hit with that or seen that argument.
The reason. It might have some iota of truth behind it, but it's certainly not the entire.
Right. It's not like a driving force that you should make policy on. It's maybe something you consider. Right. Definitely, you consider it. But I would think you would consider far more Zelensky coming to Washington and being like, hey, so when are we joining NATO? And Biden refusing to rule it out and sending tons of weapons, right? Like, these are probably more proximate causes. For me.
I mean, I'd even put the idea that Putin is dying and he wants to recreate Russian Empire over the United States is weak, and therefore he decided to invade. I'd put that reason first.
We do not look weak. Russia spends $80 billion a year on their military. The Chinese barely spend $200 million. We spend $1 trillion. They hide it away in a bunch of different budgets, but when you gather it all up, add it all up, it's basically $1 trillion. I mean,
yeah.
Really, the only shocking thing is that our military isn't way more powerful and high tech. Like the Israelis, for a couple $100 million, built laser defense systems to shoot down missiles. Where the hell are our lasers? The Pentagon spent $100 million since a month ago. Where's our lasers? Maybe they're hiding them. Maybe it's a secret. I don't know.
I'm asking the same questions, man.
$500 for a hammer, you know, and let them, you know, boondoggle us with stuff like the F-35, you guys' favorite plane, you know.
I love that one.
And just have warehouses full of tanks, like we're going to go fight the Battle of Kursk or something, you know. But then these think tanks who are literally funded by our government writing papers about how, oh, yeah, if, you know, we would fight a tank battle with the Russians over Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. And they never even mention nuclear weapons, obviously, because if you write something like, well, we actually can't fight the Chinese or the Russians because they have nukes. Well, who the hell's going to hire you to write anything? That's boring.
Mm-hmm.
I know.
Mm-hmm.
There's not going to be any tank battle.
Are you serious?
Buddy, there's going to be no big tank battle. Sorry.
No, there's not going to be any big tank. That's right. Like, it shouldn't be controversial because it's just a fact.
Sorry to burst the bubble.
Next big giant battle is going to be all autonomous. I'm calling it now. It's going to be all entirely autonomous. Lots of drones, maybe some autonomous land vehicles, but it's going to be autonomous.
Well,
I really hope that efforts to curb autonomous weapons are successful, or more successful than efforts at nuclear non-proliferation, because autonomous weapons, combining them with advances in biotechnology, could yield some very, very scary stuff, like stuff straight out of the defense planning guidance dreams, right? Like, didn't they have something in there about like using weapons to target the genetic code of certain populations? Like,
yeah,
man.
And rebuilding
defenses. At the end of Cold War I, I mean, what? We gone home at the end of Cold War I, then what happens? Russia's weak and pathetic, and the Europeans figure out some way to get along with them. They resolve the Balkans crisis eventually, or they don't, and it resolves itself. Better than what we got in Europe now. In terms of the, you know, the Indo-Pacific, I mean, China wants Taiwan back. It's part of China, according to them, according to the UN, according to our government. And it is 80 miles from their coast. And we have literally been preventing the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War for 70 years, despite our insistence 50 years ago that we were going to work towards peaceful reunification, which we never did. I mean, we held the Taiwanese back as late as the George W. Bush administration, but that policy was totally unsuccessful and quickly reversed. And actually, the current leader of Taiwan was the protege of the person who lost the election back then under George W. Bush, because George W. Bush had the common sense to slap down talk of independence. So,
unfortunately, I think we're well beyond a point where reunification of Taiwan into China is a possibility at this juncture. They've developed a national identity that is strong enough to make that not a possibility. I mean, we even look at places like Hong Kong, who never really were entirely autonomous and attached to the mainland. When, you know, the British turned that part over, you know, you can see exactly how China treated their, you know, their autonomy or their, you know, semblance of autonomy, and it evaporated overnight. Effectively, that's not going to fly in Taiwan. And the fact that it is close, it's 80 miles off the coast or so, but we're talking about, you know, we've had lengthy conversations about, you know, cracking down on Taiwan or invading Taiwan. It's not a simple task. I just don't see that as a realist policy to say, hey, let's go ahead and let them reunify. That'll be a bloody reunification. That won't be a coming, you know, together of brothers. That's going to be a war.
if it happens in the next decade, it will have to be through a war. If it waits till 2050, the point when they've marked for like the total rejuvenation of China, which would mean total territorial integrity, and they have worked very assiduously to resolve outstanding border disputes with their many, many neighbors. So it's not like China hasn't been trying to work the diplomatic channels. It's that Taiwan, with Washington's backing, never felt compelled to follow through, and in fact started getting very mixed messages after George W. Bush. And they've developed their own national identity. That's all great. I think they could possibly defend themselves, but I don't think the U.S. could intervene in that conflict.
I don't think the U.S. should intervene in that conflict, really, even if we could.
You think
what are you, a Xi Jinping apologist? We needed
No, I just don't think we should, because
not only
it's insane.
Really, we couldn't. I mean, they could just mine the crap out of those waters, and their subs would be prowling everywhere, and their coast is bristling with carrier-destroying missiles, and they're developing a whole new class of nuclear missiles whose only purpose is to threaten the United States. Why? Well, we threaten them, one. Two, in the event of a fight over Taiwan, they want to be able to keep us at arm's length, and it's part of the area strategy. They aren't coy about it. They write openly about it, which so much for, keeping silent and hiding your capabilities and whatnot. I think really the only criticism maybe you could make of the Chinese leadership is that they felt way too overconfident by the apparent stumbles of the United States under the total failed administration of the George W. Bush years, who oversaw disastrous wars that made us weak and ineffectual, and then a financial crisis that was totally preventable, but that, paralyzed Western economies, while China, because it wasn't super integrated into global capital markets, really weathered 2008 and the ensuing Eurozone crisis very well. I mean, it gave them a lot of confidence that now was the time to step forward, to be aggressive. They started drawing their lines in the, South and East China Sea, building up those fake islands, the atolls and stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's tough.
Telegraphing your capabilities militarily is unto itself a strategy, because what it does is it forces your adversaries to divert your production and your R&D in military capability towards countering those things that you've telegraphed. As examples, like the Russians are really good with, let's say the S-400, S-500 anti-missile systems. Why? Because they were very well aware of the threat of short and intermediate range ballistic missiles that were sitting in, NATO territory not far away. So they needed to be able to divert a whole lot of money into that. They also diverted a whole lot of money into air superiority. That's why they have such good Sukhoi fighter jets, because they knew, understandably, that having really good, especially multi-role fighter jets is what they needed to counter the imminent threat that was telegraphed to them. Now, as an extension of that, they didn't spend a lot of money on, say, building up an aircraft carriers, because they have a limited budget, right? And so for the U.S., at least, what we could do is we could always say, hey, this is what we're building, this is what we have, and all of our adversaries have to then scramble and put all their money towards countering that. In the meantime, we have enough money to also simultaneously develop other things quietly. So whereas China is telegraphing, they might be trying to pull a page out of our book here, right? And saying they're telegraphing their capabilities with anti-ship missiles, so that the U.S. focuses more on how do we figure out how to make our carriers less vulnerable to these, anti-ship killers, right? And that's a legitimate concern for us, especially because we're still building multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers. And, there are prized possessions. To my knowledge, I don't think we've lost any carriers. I could be wrong about that in World War II.
Harbor.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's probably the only time. But since then, these are our prize carriers. I mean, looking at the Moskva ship that Russia lost in the Ukraine war, that was a big hit, because they already don't have an extremely capable surface, Navy. They have good submarines, that is, but their surface Navy isn't great. But that loss of that ship, their flagship in that region, that's a big hit. So again, coming back to China, I think them telegraphing what they're doing might be taking a page out of our book and making us focus more on how do we shore up our surface naval vessels in such a way to make them more effective in a potential conflict, let's say, with in Taiwan vis-a-vis China. It's possible that they're also working on some other stuff on the side that we don't know about, right? And while their on the books military budget doesn't seem to be big enough to support multiple giant military R&D, maybe there's something else going on that we don't know. And so I'm starting to look at it from that frame of reference a little bit. But it could easily just as well be that they see weakness in us, as you pointed out.
Well, I mean, they definitely saw us as not invincible. I mean, they were terrified of the United States in the 1990s and early 2000s. I mean, we were an economic powerhouse, overwhelmingly powerful. And we were just going around invading any country we wanted. Sometimes we got a UN resolution, but if they said no or threw any wrenches in the system, we just did it anyway. It was terrifying for them and for the Russians. I mean, you can literally read it in their papers, in their think tank stuff. Like, they were totally terrified. I'll say this about China. They don't even spend 2% of GDP yet on their military. And that's because they're still a developing economy. They have a long way to go. And there was a policy debate in the 1980s as they started to grow rich. Should we work on power projection capabilities, or should we work on making sure that we can just defend ourselves? And they opted for the latter. It was cheaper and it was more practical, because those missiles and those mines, one of their like rocket mines, which if you're familiar with these, basically a sub lays a mine on the seafloor and it has like a propulsion system. And so when a rival submarine passes over it, it basically shoots up and blasts it. These things cost like $7,000.
Right. And you can buy a lot of them.
So doing it on a budget. They have literally more mines than all other countries on Earth combined when you look at sea mines. I mean, they could. And the thing about the U.S., when I look at our capabilities, one thing that really stands out to me is like we've encountered difficulties with mines going all the way back to our scuffles in the Persian Gulf with the Iranians. And we still have like zero minesweeping capabilities, even going forward. Like, it's just not a priority. It's not very sexy, minesweepers. We want to build another $14 billion supercarrier that costs, billions of dollars each year just to run. I mean, power projection is impossible without aircraft carriers. And the U.S. is basically just one giant floating aircraft carriers with a bunch more that it can deploy. The Russians didn't care about aircraft carriers because they just don't have very good ports. They were much poorer than us and couldn't do much with it. But they also would have had to sail those aircraft carriers past Turkey, who was a NATO member, into the Mediterranean, which was also basically a de facto NATO lake. And so they were basically left with like some seasonal ports. Well, that's no good, not very useful. And subs are way cheaper, and more effective at, projecting, difficulties for your opponent on a budget. So, I mean, but realistically speaking, though, when I look at China, and that region over there, why are we so, and when I say we, I mean our policy establishment, why are we so convinced that they're just about to dominate that whole region and that they're all just going to turn into client kingdoms? That's never happened. Bandwagoning doesn't happen. Balancing happens, and it was already happening anyway. India has no interest in being dominated by China. Japan has no interest in being dominated by China. Australia, the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, name all those countries. They have historical beefs with China, and they don't like China, and they're scared of China, and they welcome balancing efforts. And so, for the hawks who say like, yeah, we should try and balance China, it's like, okay, even if that's true, we could do it in a way more laid back, behind the scenes role. Like, if you want to help coordinate efforts between Japan and Australia with the Quad and whatnot, okay, it's definitely not my policy preference, but at least it's not stupid and, unnecessary, which our policy is unnecessary. It is unnecessarily aggressive and it's in their face. And the Chinese, and even the way the media report on this stuff is so damaging. For example, the Chinese and the Americans are going to talk about some trade issues at an upcoming summit today. It might have already happened. I'm not sure what time it is there right now. But anyway, the report, and this is Reuters, right, which is supposed to be like as objective as breaking news can get. China and U.S. ready to come to blows over trade talks. And it's like, really what you're saying is have disagreements over trade.
Right. They just have to sensationalize the title.
You do, yeah. And the militarization of our discourse, even when talking about things like trade and exchange and diplomatic correspondences, and it's because, frankly, we just have a way too big and powerful military with no real threats to ourselves. And so you have to go find something to, make it worthwhile so that you can justify spending $1 trillion a year and putting us further and further in debt, even though the whole democracies against autocracy thing is just obvious crap. Just look at our list of allies. Just the other day, the Biden administration was singing the praise of the Qataris. The Qataris, are they a democracy? No, obviously not, right? Just like you want to talk about Somalia. Mm-hmm. We befriended dictator after dictator, warlord after warlord. We don't give a shit. It's about our interests or perceived interests. Going all the way back to the Cold War. Like, tons of countries that weren't democracies joined NATO. Like, not tons. It wasn't the majority, but there were a handful of countries that weren't democracies who joined NATO. It's not complicated, and yet people fall for it time and time again. In this country, I should say. I've found that people I talk to from other countries are much more, cynical about U.S. intentions, as well they should be. Because, just a strict look at the body count, and in terms of keeping us safe, I just always ask people this question, because I've run all the numbers and I've figured out that over the last 20 years, if you had taken all that money that we wasted on foreign adventures and given it all to American households, each household would have gotten like $100,000. So I ask you, would you rather have Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Ukraine, for $100,000? What's it going to be? What do you want?
I definitely want the $100,000.
What would
I
you
just bought a condo. Pay that shit off.
You want to have those amazing interventions, or you want 100K?
This is a tough question.
For office, so I'm trying this out.
Well, Assad did have to go, but he didn't go.
To be clear, Joe, you're talking
Saddam
about
Hussein did gas the Kurds. So,
Joe, you're
after
talking.
Gaddafi gave his soldiers Viagra to rape civilian women,
according to the New York Times.
According to sources from the intelligence agency.
I shouldn't pick on just the New York Times. They all reported those lies.
Yeah, they all get. What happens is they all have the same intelligence sources, and their spook says something to them, and then they all report the same thing. They're like, "Oh, according to senior intelligence officials, we don't have
exactly.
The U.S. has no contact. We have no idea what Ukraine is doing." See, going back to the beginning. I'm convinced that this is the narrative that's shifting, that's being put out, where we're saying, well, how could we have known that the Ukraine was going to lose the war? Like they weren't telling us what was really going on. That's what I ultimately think.
So you think this is part of a change in narrative to prepare the American people for?
Yeah, I do. I think Ukraine,
an outright Russian victory, or like some sort of negotiated settlement, or
I don't know. Because
at The Economist just this last week, they were talking about how, well, Russia is kind of grounding it out. It's ugly, but they are winning. And that's The Economist, who are like super hawkish.
So most mainstream media outlets are coming to terms that Russia is going to inevitably win this war, and they control the battlefield. Listen, Zelensky said that 100 soldiers are dying a day. And then an additional 500 soldiers are wounded. We're talking about 500, 600 casualties a day in Donbass. How can they sustain that? And that's most likely on the low end. It's like the Russians are kind of acting like a boa constrictor. They're just wrapping, and they're slowly just strangling the Ukrainian army. And the casualties that they're taking right now in Donbass are so high. And I don't think these guys they're not being
fire from the Russians has just been punishing.
The Russians are rotating their soldiers in and out. Like the Ukrainians, the professional army in Ukraine is just kind of stuck entrenched in either their trenches and their bunkers, and the Russian infantry just comes in to clean up the scraps after heavy artillery fire. Like I don't see how there could be a way that Ukraine comes back and wins this war. I don't think it's possible. The question now is can the Ukrainian military retreat from the Donbass and go beyond the Dnieper River east of it, and then fortify their defenses there, because now the Russians.
The question then is, do you even have a viable Ukraine left? If you chop off the eastern portion of the country and much of the southern portion of the country, do you even have a viable state left for Ukraine?
Define viable.
Just going to live on Western aid? Because the food thing with the Odessa stuff, like the Ukrainians mined the port to block access to Odessa, and so the Russians are saying, well, I'll tell you what, if you remove the mines, we'll let you ship grain out. And we're just going to check ships that come in to make sure they're not holding any weapons, and we'll let them go get grain, and we'll let them leave. We promise. And the Ukrainians, very obviously, are saying that's a bunch of crap. We're never removing those mines. So we're kind of at that, that point, just like we were over the Minsk Accords, where the Donbass is supposed to get, some level of autonomy, but that's supposed to happen after the Russians leave or something, even though that was not what it was on paper. That was how it was later reinterpreted by the Ukrainians themselves. But you basically just have this conundrum where someone has to make the first move. Someone has to put forth and Emmanuel Macron, he's not in charge. Schultz, he's not in charge. Like, there's a reason that when something like this, tensions erupt, it's Moscow and Washington that are talking, right? So it's got to be Washington who sends a clear signal to the Ukrainians that it's time to start looking for a negotiated settlement here. And I find it so interesting that for years, Washington basically supported, not implementing the agreement, and now is basically faced with a scenario where, wow, wouldn't the Minsk agreements have been great? It would have been a whole Ukraine, a not invaded and smashed to pieces Ukraine. It couldn't have been in NATO, but it's not going to be in NATO anyway. Not a useful Ukraine. So what was all this for?
So I'm convinced that if Zelensky makes a deal, well, here's my conspiratorial mind working. I think, how all these Azov guys were stuck in the steel plant over in Mariupol for like a long time. Mm-hmm. And, there were all these stories about an evacuation and how they weren't getting it. I'm convinced that Zelensky wants these guys dead, would rather have these hard right wing or like these hardcore right wing guys in Ukraine dead, because I think there'll be assassination attempts if he settles with Ukraine. What every government underestimated, and this includes the U.S. and this also includes Russia, and then all the states in the European Union, what all these countries underestimated is the power of nationalism. And Russia underestimated Ukrainian nationalism. I think that's clear. I think they expected that most of their spooks, the Russian spooks in Ukraine, I think basically said that, okay, when we invade, most governors are going to align themselves with Putin. The population is generally going to align themselves with Russia. They're Russian speakers. They hate Ukrainians. Well, that didn't happen. On the flip side, the rest of the world underestimated Russian nationalism, and they didn't expect that there was going to be this rallying behind the strong national leader that there was. Like you see all these Z symbols and stuff like that, which are, kind of borderline, you can go as far as say they're a little fascistic in their symbolism, the Z symbolism in Russia.
A little bit.
It's a hardcore nationalist symbol, meaning victory, like we're in it until the end. And what enforced that, and I think, the polling data in Russia, most of the polling I saw in Russia was like, we don't want a war at all. Like, we're not interested in fighting a big war. This is something that we don't want. Well, now that has changed to like 70-80% of the population is in favor of this war. And I think what has reinforced that is that the collective Russophobia, the collective sanctions put the state in a power to sell the war to his people, that this is us against the world right now. This is existential. Like, if we don't win this war, this is the end of our state as we know it. And that's why there's popular support, and that's why I don't even think Russia can settle for what they have right now. Like, I think Russia probably, to sell this as like a worthwhile endeavor to its people, I think they need to, get at least all the way to Odessa.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough because polling data is very difficult from Russia. There's a couple,
especially in Russia too,
that actually are like pretty good. And I think we have to also take into consideration that you are literally not even allowed legally to call what's going on a war or an invasion. But there has been a noticeable rally around the flag effect, which was predictable. It happened the last time they did this back in 2014. I mean, wars make states, and then states make wars. It's not complicated. People feel under threat when people are different. And you know what? For all the talk about how totalitarian Putin's Russia is, its citizens actually had almost totally open access to the internet, including Western media. And for years, all they've read is how evil and nefarious and bad Russia and Vladimir Putin are. Now, from the Russian perspective, Putin is actually not that bad for the average Russian. And you have to have had lived through the 1990s in Russia, probably, to appreciate Putin's rule. Because to me, it seems despotic and awful. No, never want to live there. But if I had lived in Russia in the 1990s and early 2000s, maybe I would feel differently. Average life expectancy under Putin has gone up 10 years. Average income has almost doubled. I don't even know what people expected. That, constantly demonizing a guy who's basically like a center-right kind of Republican kind of guy. They act like he's like the hard edge of the most nationalist, crazy Russians out there, which is just not true at all. I mean, I think we're way more likely, if Putin
drops dead,
dies, or
if he drops dead,
taken out in a coup, we are not going to see some Western happy dude taking his place.
Alexei Navalny is going to become president of Russia.
The halls of power are filled with crazy anti-Western hawks, a lot of whom think Putin has been a Western dupe.
That is the main. That's what I've been trying to tell people, is that there's more criticism of Putin from the right.
Oh yeah.
Than the liberal left.
He looks behind the wall, constantly falling for Western lies.
Like Dmitry Medvedev. If you hear his rhetoric, Medvedev has been saying, it's kind of been like a spokesman for the war. He's been saying some of the more kind of like aggressive things, saying things like, when Sweden and Finland said they were going to join NATO, he was like, well, they're going to be on the nuclear calculation list now. Like, when there's a nuclear war, they'll be nuked. He's been, he's Putin's boy. He was a president of Russia when Putin went down to prime minister, and Medvedev was seen as like a Western shill for a really long time. Like he was like, oh, Medvedev, and now he's like, saying all this. He's more of a Russian nationalist. The criticism that Putin gets is right now the primary criticism is, why haven't you just declared all out war already? Why are we like, why is this taking so long? Why don't we just call cities? Like, why don't we just go engage in total war right now and win this for all? Like, there's nothing else that we can do. That's the criticism that he's getting. Like, the amount of criticism that he got for not just completely obliterating the Avastopol factory.
Azovstal. Yeah.
Avastol.
I mean, the U.S. would have just called in an airstrike, right? Dropped a 5-pound bomb all over them.
Like a bunker buster.
Yeah.
Like the amount of criticism he got for that, for not completely like leveling that steel factory, was intense in Russia. Yeah. And if he dropped dead tomorrow, I think you would be really scared who would be the guy, the next president of Russia.
I'm very scared.
It's not going to be Alexei Navalny. Sorry to break your heart. Alexei Navalny is a construct that was created from the West.
Big heart for the anti-Muslim.
He's a YouTuber. He's a fucking YouTuber. The people these people who are like coming up the ranks in political power are
hardline
people who gained. Well, I'm just saying, like, the people who, like the United States and the West, fetishize their popular personalities that are used because they've created goodwill with the country. That's what Zelensky is. He was an actor, comedian. He was a popular actor and comedian in Ukraine and Russia. He created enough goodwill with the country where people are like, fuck it, yeah, let's do it. Like Matthew McConaughey type guy.
I might be governor of Texas someday.
It's
The Rock might be our president.
But he's being used by nefarious people for political end. And
it's always been clear.
I don't think that I think in Russia, they're very allergic to people who they think are Western shills. And the real opposition party in Russia to Putin has always, or to Yeltsin as well, it's always been it's always been the Communist Party in Russia.
Yeah. Well, the liberals in Russia have suffered many defeats, and like there's basically no liberal caucus. I mean, our establishment will trot out some expat, and it's like like 100 million.
Who's this guy?
You found one guy like to say something anti-Putin. Like there's just no liberal electorate, especially outside the cities. And even, yes, a lot of the young, they want, speech freedoms and things like that. Economic liberalization, though, and westernization for a lot of the country is it's just too associated with the experience of the 1990s. And a lot of people don't know this, but there's been whole books written by our people about it. Some of them just kind of bragging about it, others being more critical, but basically explaining how we destroyed the Russian economy. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we sent our boys over there and our girls to teach them how to run things properly, and proceeded to basically destroy the economy and turn it into an oligarch's playground. I mean, and Yeltsin was, and then their experience of democracy was the Clinton administration intervening in the election, which we've talked about, to make sure Boris Yeltsin got elected. Like I just think about how this must have looked to someone like Putin, who was close to the halls of power, who saw how privatization worked and saw how democracy worked, and very quickly decided these are mostly shams that the powerful use to stay in power.
Hey, and just to add one thing to that. So how the presidential, Putin has very strong presidential powers. All those were created
by Yeltsin.
While Yeltsin was president, all those
After
like real strong
shelling
presidents.
the parliament,
Yeah,
literally rolling tanks in there, and he was our guy. Putin
You know why?
destroyed democracy in Russia.
Why is Russia? Why is it called a Duma in Russia? Oh, well, it's because the parliament was bombed in the 1990s by Boris Yeltsin.
Got rid of.
He disbanded. Got rid of, and then they went back to the traditional Duma. I guess that was like what the Tsar's court.
Gorbachev was the democratizer. Gorbachev was the democratizer. Yeltsin was a power-hungry drunken crook. And then he gave us Putin. So really, Clinton gave us Putin. There you go. Bill Clinton gave us Vladimir Putin. How do you like that?
And Hillary Clinton gave us Bill Clinton, so it's Hillary's fault.
That's right. I forgot. It always has to be Hillary's fault. I forgot.
Right, lock her up.
So
right.
I forgot.
So there's one more topic I want to touch on because I think it's important, and I think it goes into the whole. I think the world is being. I'm speaking off the cuff right now, and I haven't completely formulated this thought yet, but I feel like the world is being divided by. Man, I don't want to use this verbiage because it puts me in the camp of like the right wing nuts. But there's sovereign nations, nations that have like strong, who are reverting to nationalism, who have strong national identity, and then the other half of the world is. Dominated by kind of like Western liberalism. I wasn't going to say the word globalism, but I'm trying not to say the word globalism on purpose.
Globalists.
Do you have aversion to globalism because it has pejorative connotations among some crowds, or because you don't think it has any specific meaning?
I think it's so vague. I think when people say globalist, it's so vague, and it makes it sound like it's not that it's pejorative. It's just. It's like when like left-wing people call everyone Nazis and racist type thing, where it's just used as a pejorative for secret society type thing. It's not. It's vague and it's not really descriptive. I feel like when people say the word globalist, I feel like there's more descriptive words you can use to describe who people when people are called globalists. But I also have a problem with people constantly misusing the word Marxist. People like refer to everyone as Marxist. They're not. I don't think they're Marxist. I think that they're just corporatist. But the point I'm trying to make is that, and I'm still defining this, is that you have nations like India, you have nations like China. You have nations like Turkey, for example, which I want to get to, who are sovereign nations who have independent foreign policies. And then you have other states that are basically kind of like city-states from ancient Rome, from the Roman Empire. Like countries in Europe don't have their own independent foreign policy. It's the United States policy. It's really whatever the United States says goes. Germany doesn't have its own independent foreign policy. It's U.S. foreign policy. Like, look at Olaf Scholz. Olaf Scholz, Green Party, a tradition of trying to practice détente with Russia, was pretty sober prior to the invasion in terms of rhetoric and what German policy would be. Was pressured and collapsed like a folding chair. Like I've never seen a leader collapse so hard as Olaf Scholz has.
But be praised so strong, right?
And he can't win either. And it's so funny. Olaf Scholz is in the funniest position ever. He's definitely gonna go down as like one of the most politically unsavvy guys. Like Boris Johnson's a bastard, and I think everyone should hate him for everything that he's done, especially if I was in Britain and I've learned about how his the parties that he was throwing and stuff like that. Like, what a bastard.
And
but he's more politically savvy than Olaf Scholz. Olaf Scholz went back on his principles, and now he gets shit from both sides. So now basically everyone hates him in Germany. And actually, the hardliners hate him.
Yeah. And his party got hammered in some really key elections.
Yeah. Yeah.
The results from Schleswig-Holstein, people tried to play that down. But then the big Rhineland vote came, and it was like, oh, nope, actually people are pissed. So well, it was by design though. They weren't supposed to have an independent foreign policy by design. I mean, you think about how much it costs to maintain the type of military establishment that we have. And you look at Europe's phenomenally luxurious welfare states. Like, they work like 30-hour weeks, retire at 60. Have way better retirements than us. And it's like, I mean, there was a meme that went around.
6 weeks of vacation or 2 months worth of vacation. What the fuck is that? America, we have 2 weeks. We get 2 weeks vacation here.
I'll tell you what, every once in a while, a meme just really sums it up well. And it was just a runway. It's an airfield. Just loaded with F-35s. And it was like, and the caption was, Russia is about to find out why Americans don't have universal health care. And that is that's damn true, because Bernie Sanders, Captain Free College and Healthcare, voted for the F-35 program, just like he votes for all the silly interventions we do, because he knows what gets paid and what doesn't, and what's popular and what doesn't. And he's a politician. And tasked with choosing between your college and debt and stuff, he chooses manufacturing jobs and war. And he's what passes for a socialist in this country, right? Like, that's insane. We have no left in this country. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, supports NATO expansion. What kind of left do we have? No left at all.
The left in this country this is why I hate it when people are like, oh, the Marxist, communist, far left Democrats. They're not far left Democrats. They're not far leftist. The communist Marxist types, like real socialist types in the United States, are probably the most marginalized political community in this country. I don't think there is a more marginalized political community than communist.
You throw our Democrats into Germany, they're CDU people. You throw.
Ain't that the truth? Yep.
Yeah. I mean, there's no real left. I mean, you're right. Throwing Marxist around, we should just eliminate that word. Neoliberal, Marxist, those are globalists. Those are all words we should just eliminate from our discourse, because as George Orwell said, when words stop meaning anything at all, they get abused. And, someone like Nancy Pelosi will come out and say something, and people will blow up Twitter like, she's a Marxist communist.
She's a far left who loves trading free market capital.
Like, she is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but doesn't want you to have universal health care, doesn't want the rich to pay taxes. Like, are you crazy?
I love
gotta have your eyes wide closed to think that she's a Marxist.
I love her. She was questioned about Congress, elected officials trading stocks, and she's like, I think that elected officials should have access to the free market. Next question.
Nancy Pelosi is a more successful investor than Warren Buffett.
You know the comedian Kyle Dunnigan? You ever hear of him?
Oh,
he does really funny impressions of Joe Biden. He does a great impression of Nancy Pelosi.
And she always has skeleton hands.
Like a money ball. He has like what's his name show from CNN? Kramer. Why am I forgetting his first name? Jim Cramer.
Jim Cramer.
Jim Cramer's show where she's picking stocks. But it's like she's like, at first I wasn't successful at the market, but then I got in Congress and created laws.
it's outrageous too, because even the very sparse rules that they made for themselves about stock trading, they violate them all the time with no consequences at all. Right, left, doesn't matter. They all do it.
And you put Martha Stewart in jail.
Yeah, right. They put Martha Stewart in jail. Yeah,
adding value.
I am not pro very many initiatives that inhibit people's freedom. But if you're sitting in Congress, you got to have your funds passively managed or actively managed by someone else. It's outrageous that they're allowed to trade on their privileged information, and we act like it's not insider trading.
No, they got to make insider trading
how dangerous it's going to be, and they all went and started dumping equities.
Mm-hmm.
What? That's outrageous behavior. And it maybe gets mentioned on a news cycle, and then it's just, forget it. Who gives a shit?
Hey, it's just Washington.
Trump's racist, and Biden is weak, and Obama was a Muslim, and that's what passes for political discourse if you turn on television and if you check Twitter.
Man. It is real stupid out there.
It's
like
bad.
It is real stupid listening to it's on the right and left. Man.
Yeah.
It is real dumb.
And you were so right. You called it like a year ago. You were like, Joe, you watch. The neoconservatives are going to be in the ascendancy now that Trump is gone. And they're just mad. They're just so ready. They hated Donald Trump for that. Even though Trump eventually was bullied into going along with all their policies anyway.
Yeah, it's like they got what they wanted anyway with Trump. He was the only thing they castrated Trump almost instantly. Like the castration of Trump before he was elected, they already took his people away. Like his people were gone. The people who were feeding him that American first type policy, like Bannon was gone. He was forced to cut ties with Bannon, basically. Mike Flynn was gone. Mike Flynn is fucking crazy, by the way. I'm not trying to endorse Mike Flynn.
He's crazy, but he also did nothing unusual or criminal.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that. Also means that he wasn't trapped by the FBI. But I follow Mike Flynn on Telegram.
Oh yeah, he's crazy.
He's a bona fide crazy nut job. He's not
QAnon. But
he is QAnon crazy. He's QAnon crazy.
I heard him on a hot mic calling them all crazy.
Oh, he was?
Look it up. I don't know if afterwards he beat back from that, but he got hot mic calling.
Oh, you know what? He's just fucking. Then he's just a crook who's just playing on that. Then.
Oh yeah.
All right. He's just some crook who's playing on these dumb boomers who get caught up in that stuff. But he's but his QAnon his Telegram is all QAnon shit. And,
is it?
Oh yeah. He looks like a real crazy person. But then again,
I mean, he was crazy awful ideas, and I'm glad he didn't get a position in the government. But I also think that it was totally outrageous the way that he was prevented from taking his position in the government. That is not the CIA and FBI's prerogative, and they made it their prerogative, and they used our mainstream media outlets to do this. Just like killing the Hunter Biden laptop story. Twitter literally immediately suspended the New York Post account, and the CIA and their people literally gave information to the New York Times where they basically said, yeah, it's all bullshit. And the New York Times just, uncritically just repeated, according to X and current intelligence sources, this is a very obvious
signed letter from 40 members of the intelligence community that this is Russian information. This is Russian propaganda. Meanwhile, it was like instantly confirmed that it was actually his laptop.
Later, this is what I mean about being the paper of record. 6 months later, they run this tiny little, actually that was correct, but also nothing's going on. Yeah, that was true, but, it didn't influence the election. The Russians did that.
Yeah. I mean, what was there to confirm? It's this Hunter Biden smoking crack, getting a foot job. What is there to confirm? What is his face superimposed on that?
Yeah, and the whole thing about him getting the job with Burisma, like, I don't even know what there was to wonder about or investigate. I know it was like a conservative talking point for years, and it's obviously true. It's obviously true. Joe Biden was handed Ukraine. That was part of his portfolio when he was the vice president. And oh my God, then his son winds up with a no-show job for $1 million a year with a natural gas company in Ukraine, which he knows nothing about. Gee, I wonder what was happening there. Do we need evidence at all to call this what it is? I got better things to do than to wait around for someone to finally fess up, right? Which we are finally getting to the bottom of things, but I don't know, it'll probably be the IRS that gets him in the end. That's who gets everybody. Don't mess with the government's money.
Nope.
That's serious. That gets serious right away.
Well,
You can lie and steal it from whoever you want, but it better not be the government. They will get you.
so so here was the point I was trying to get to. Turkey. I keep on getting lost.
Oh yeah. Turkey. Right.
Turkey. So
Okay.
Turkey. So Turkey first. All right, let me just pull this back a little bit so everyone has some context so they know what we're talking about. Sweden and Finland have historically been neutral. They haven't been part of NATO. In Finland's case, and Sweden, I don't think it really matters if they join NATO or not. They're so aligned with European policy. I don't think the Russians really care. On the other hand, Finland shares a border with Russia. Finland fought a war with Russia in this century. And Finland has been a neutral country during the Cold War, and Finland probably has. I mean, I don't know that much about the Finnish economy, but I hear their living standards are pretty good. They've been a successful state. So both governments are trying to join NATO. And the opposition to joining NATO has come from Turkey. And Turkey, at first, I thought Turkey was just trying to kind of bargain with them, say, oh, they want to do something. We got some gripes about this. We can get some concessions over their NATO membership. We'll ultimately agree, but we're going to see what we can get out of it. And what Turkey wants is they want access to they want to get back into the F-35 program. And they also want both countries to label the Kurds as terrorist organizations. And because they historically have showed camaraderie and have backed the Kurds in northern Syria and Iraq and in Turkey as well. And so he wants them to label them as terrorist organizations. And first and foremost, man, the Kurds always are getting fucked.
I know.
Talk about a group of people who just get screwed around by everyone. But he said that there's I just heard a statement from him saying like, no, this is not good timing. It wouldn't be appropriate for them to join NATO. I'm going to veto it. So it seems like Turkey really is one of those rare exceptions that is actually a sovereign nation that makes its own policy at the very least. You say what you want about Erdogan. I definitely have a lot of complaints about Erdogan and not at all think he's a good man, but he's definitely a skill. He's a much more skilled statesman than really anyone in the European Union. So I wanted to get your take on that. Like, do you think that Turkey is acting reasonable? Do you think that Turkey is acting more just self-interest? What are your thoughts?
My thoughts?
Yeah.
Well, I think like you, I had the same initial reaction, which was, okay, they obviously want to squeeze a few concessions out of this because this is a big one. It's a big one, and it's got to be unanimous. And Turkey's been on the outs with Washington. They've had that for all of Erdogan's accomplishments. I have to say he really made a mess of a lot of his relationships over the last 5 to 10 years, and he's been really working hard to re-ingratiate himself. He's made a horrible mess of Turkey's economy. I mean, the situation is just terrible there, and so. Boy, it's tough to say how that's going to shake out. I mean, Washington sent a pretty unmistakable message to Turkey after Erdogan's most recent round of statements, which was basically like, yeah, maybe we will have to support Kurdish fighters if Turkish troops move in there. And it's like, so we're gonna have NATO-backed troops fight each other now? Is that what's gonna happen? And it's basically just a thinly veiled threat of like, listen, we all know who calls the shots here, so we will make your life extremely difficult. You're already getting on our nerves. Like, when you read official statements and stuff like that, like, you just have to think, how would a bully talk to someone? Because that's basically what the United States does. You can read about it in foreign affairs. They brag about it, why the U.S. can get away with bullying its allies. So it's not complicated, and as far as that goes, the U.S. is very determined that those countries will join NATO, and they will do what it takes to get Turkey to go along with it. I don't know if it'll be F-35s. I don't know if it'll be some kind of token acknowledgement of what's their group again? The PLA, the KPA? The Kurdish.
There's a couple. There's a couple of different ones.
A few other ones, but
there's the one in Syria, the one in Iraq, and the one that's mainly in Turkey. But they hate them all, and they basically associate all the Kurdish groups the same.
Yeah, and they've harbored, terrorists. I mean, one man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter, right? I mean, I'm sure in
Turkey's defense, they do have terrorist attacks from Kurds.
Yeah, I don't dispute it. I just mean, that kind of stuff happens. States have interests. They don't really care about the interests of states weaker than them, unless they need them to do something. Yeah, I mean, that's I think Erdogan does try and steer his own ship. I also think that's part of why he's in the domestic state that he's in, is because he basically burned a lot of bridges. He pissed off his fellow Sunnis, and then he went and pissed off the Americans, and then he went and pissed off the Europeans. So the Europeans had to kind of play nice with him a lot because of the migrants that they pay him not to allow to enter into Europe. It's a pretty simple quid pro quo there. So they have to kind of play ball with him a little bit. The other Sunni states in the area are super pissed off at him, kind of following the Saudis' lead. But I mean, Erdogan has been on a super charm offensive in the region, because he's trying to attract capital. Because I don't know if you like follow Turkey's economy at all, but like, I mean, its inflation rate is, last time I checked, it was like over 50%. I mean, they need help bad. And the Gulf monarchies could give it to them. And so maybe a little bit of contrarianism, trying to show that, because Erdogan's big innovation was embracing Turkey's Islamism, right? Because prior to that, it was from Kemal Ataturk onward, it was supposed to be a Western facing country, more European than Arab, or whatever you want to say, because they're Turks, not embracing Islam, trying to be more like a Western country. And Erdogan is a total rebuke of that whole idea. So it's complicated, and obviously I don't have a crystal ball. I do know that Washington gets what it wants with its friends, nominal friends and allies. So Finland and Sweden will join NATO. And if Turkey wants to throw a big old fit about it, I wouldn't be shocked if Washington just said, you know what? Unanimity is no longer required. You guys are in. What's Turkey going to do about it? Quit? What's anybody going to do about it? Nothing. The U.S. is NATO. They supply half the money, all the arms. I mean,
I am the Senate.
Yeah, it's really messed up because liberal hegemony is a very interesting form of control because it uses institutions that are nominally voluntary, but when one member is overwhelmingly preponderant, it can use its weight to get its way a lot. And that's why the U.S. has been so opposed to any institution building by China. So, we really don't have time to go into all that stuff, but I mean, China has really been working hard to build parallel institutions where it can write the rules, it can hold, and keep the U.S. out. Like the U.S. likes to use its institutions. I mean, successive Russian leaders asked Washington, like, "Hey, could we join NATO?" And Washington was like, "Yeah, maybe, yeah. I mean, we're not gonna close the door on it. We'll talk. Yeah, we'll talk. You know." Behind closed doors, they were like, "That's never gonna happen. You know, they're gonna want an equal say in. That's not gonna happen. You know, we've got a whole docile collection of basically pro-consular states in terms of their foreign policy, as you pointed out. Every once in a while, someone will throw a tiff and not want to go along with something, but like that's the problem with Europe not having its own foreign policy, is because anytime Washington wants to do something, they automatically have members of the coalition of the willing, especially the new Europe, old Europe divide. And Emmanuel Macron, as much as I'm pleased that he's trying to get towards an off-ramp, he's making it impossible politically to get Washington out of Europe, because the Eastern Europeans never trusted the French and Germans to look after their interests. They had plenty of experience with that going back to the aftermath of the First World War and the Second World War. And so Rumsfeld, for all the imbecilic things he did, he recognized astutely, immediately, these new Eastern European countries are much better to work with than the Germans and the French, because they're totally on board with whatever we want to do. You know, the French and the Germans have always had misgivings about U.S. policy toward Russia. And, you know, that was part of what the gas pipelines were for. It was to make Europe and Russia harmoniously intertwined. But their economic development and political development, the integration of the two, was really retarded by military policy for the continent still being directed by Washington. So, you know, I just kind of always throw up my hands at the end of this stuff. Like, we're in a huge fucking mess. And I won't pretend that any of my policy recommendations are magic bullets, but certainly pushing harder in the direction we've been going seems to me the definition of just insanity. These policies have not worked. They've made everyone worse off, much poorer. Even the whole "they kept the peace" after the Second World War, that is just a white people way of looking at things. Because if you lived in a lot of countries in the developing world that weren't white, it was not peaceful and it was not prosperous. So the idea that, you know, Washington's hegemony has just been this blessing to the world is to take a very narrow view of things. And I just feel like there's no, they call it great power autism is what it's called in the literature. But it's basically the inability of hugely powerful states to understand the concerns of others and the way their actions are perceived by others. I see no evidence that we make even the slightest attempt at doing that. So, except for token. Yes. Like, we're gonna fight pain for anti-inflation, shape China's environment to make sure it's not strong, you know. But also, we'd love your help with fighting terrorism and nuclear proliferation. Is that cool? Obviously not. Why would it be? Right? I mean, that's why North Korea still exists. It's because Beijing knows that if the North Korean regime goes, that peninsula that adjoins it and is contiguous with it is going to be dominated by Seoul, which means dominated by the United States, which is just unacceptable. We would never tolerate that for a second. Only one country tried in our immediate vicinity, and it was invaded, impoverished, and we tried to murder its leadership like 36 times. So, I don't know. Go USA.
It's very American of you to say, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I love America. I love the fact that we're a country where you could actually have real liberalism because we face no threats. A country like China can never be fully liberal because it is surrounded by potential enemies. We can live in total freedom and prosperity here in the United States because we face no threats at all. But you look at a country like Poland, who are very tough on dissent to the government and, outside the parliament, well, they're like a frontline Cold War state. What do you want them to do? Like, let people purposefully be sabotaging their national unity? Like,
well, the only threats that we face are the ones that we manufacture ourselves. So, keeps us on our toes.
It does. We're our own best enemy. We ran out of enemies, as Colin Powell said. He was complaining. I'm out of enemies, basically. So we made our own enemies. There's actually not a small amount of thinking among, like, the more conspiratorially minded that, like, basically Washington allowed Beijing to just get super rich so that they'd actually have someone to fight eventually. There's like a neocon. I have a whole collection of like the worst of the neocon essays, and there's one in there that's basically like, China isn't yet worthy of, great power competition. It'll probably be about 20 years. And so while we're waiting for them to build that up, we'll take care of like Iraq and Iran and, just a few other things before we go fight with them. It's like, okay, or we could not. I mean, that an option? Because I vote for that option.
Well, they don't have clearly thinking people that make the policy. So, hopefully that changes in the very near future.
I feel like they behave totally rationally. I feel like they think totally clearly and self-interestedly. Because, as Henry pointed out, there are tons of highly intelligent and competent foreign policy thinkers in the United States who are completely shut out of the media except on a show like Tucker Carlson or maybe Kennedy over on Fox Business. I mean, we have intelligent people who understand that the way things have been going are bad and stupid. Andrew Bacevich, Graham Allison, Stephen Walt. I mean, and it's not just on, because those guys more lean toward the right. I mean, but it's on the other side too, I mean, it's they've monopolized the discourse, and there is a logic to these institutions and their setups into the career ladder. And if you want to climb it, you will stay inside the bounds of what is considered polite conversation. I will give you a quick example. If Antony Blinken invited you over for a cocktail party, would it be politic or polite of you to mention that under his former boss, we basically helped create ISIS that we then to get at Iran, and then we had to go fight them in Iraq War II or 3? Was that 3? That was Iraq War 3. Yeah. Would that be an acceptable thing to say? No, it's totally true, but it's totally out of bounds. You will never read that in foreign policy or foreign affairs, even though they write comprehensive analyses of those conflicts. You'll never read that. So,
well, Joe, I'm starting to get a little bit of internet issues here, and I'm starting to get concerned that we won't be able to finish and save up everything. And we're at about 2 hours and 16 minutes, which is awesome. Just in the interest of time, I feel like maybe we can give you a closing thoughts so that you can plug anything you like or wrap up any thoughts that you might have opened up in the show so that we can call this one a night.
Thanks. I am quite tired as well. I feel like at this point you guys know where to find me. The Mises Institute, Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, the Eurasian Review. I've also had papers published in like journals. If you read journals, Libertarian, the Journal of Libertarian Studies, Journal of the American Revolution. If you're a fellow libertarian scholar, I will be in Nashville in September. I will also be at the Libertarian Party convention speaking later this month here in Michigan. I just want you all to live safe and prosperous and happy lives, and I think my government is doing everything it can to make sure that you don't, in the sole interest of keeping on playing Age of Empires with the world. So I have nothing to lie to you about and nothing to gain from saying any of this. I have no reason to do any of this other than that I have 5 kids, and I think this is totally immoral, and we're saddling them with a whole bunch of problems and potentially a nuclear war. So, whatever. You can look me up or trash me on Twitter, but if you come to trash me on Twitter, be ready, because I definitely punch back. So
But why male models?
I appreciate your commitment to trying to just be honest about the issues, because we all agree that invasions of other countries are outrageous, right?
Right.
And we're all here just trying to live in peace and prosperity. And so thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it. It's always good talking.
It's our pleasure.
Well,
And
thank
our
you.
honor.
And I hope everyone, and thank the audience, the listeners as well. Thanks for listening to another episode of Bro History. It means a lot that you guys listen. The fact that I'm very aware that there's other shows in the world, there's other things that you can be listening to, like music or whatever, while you're, listening to podcasts. So I appreciate the attention that, I just appreciate the, the time that is given to listen, because I know that actually takes a lot, more than you think. There's only a select amount of things that you can consume a day. So if you listen to this show, really appreciate it. And if you want to support the show, you can join us on Patreon. You get access to our Slack account where we continue the conversation. We have an active community. It's very fun. And then you can also rate us on your podcast app. That's Spotify and Apple. So 5-star review, give us one of those. If you like the show, if you hate the show, then you can give us a 1-star. As long as you engage, we're fine with it. Write us a review. Say, hey, you guys are awesome, or you guys suck. And then we will be back next week. And yes, we'll be back next week. We're off until I get my wedding in July, late July. I'm going to make a firm promise that we're going to come out with an episode every week. Try to hold me to it. If we miss it, then you have permission to kick me in the balls. All right, let's end this thing.
Peace.
Peace.